Someone carried fire about 30 meters into a cave in South Africa 1,000,000 years ago. 30 meters is the problem. Lightning doesn't reach that far inside. Wind doesn't push a grass fire around a bend and down a tunnel. The Wonderwerk deposits hold ashed plant material and bone burned at fairly low temperature, the kind you get from grass, twigs, and brush, rather than a stack of logs. And the material sits where it formed instead of looking washed in from outside. Somebody brought a coal in and fed it. For most of the story that follows, people could not make fire on demand. They found it, moved it, kept it alive, and arranged the rest of their lives around not losing it. By the end of this, we get to communities still living that way in the 19th century, and to what Rome did to the woman who let the state's flame go out. A dry savanna burns on a schedule. Lightning starts it, sometimes lava, sometimes a fallen tree grinding against another in wind. And once it goes, the front can move faster than a person runs. Then it passes. What it leaves is black ground, easy walking, no snakes hidden in grass, and food that has already been cooked. Roasted tubers under the ash, small animals that didn't get out in time, seeds and nuts split open by heat. Birds work this too. Raptors in northern Australia hunt the edges of burns, and Aboriginal accounts describe some of them carrying burning sticks to spread the fire and flush prey, which biologists are still arguing about. The general rule holds either way. A fresh burn is a feeding ground, and a lot of the savanna knows it. So the first fires people used were probably other people's leftovers, in a sense. You walk in after the flames have gone through and take what's lying there. Nothing about that requires courage or invention. The next step does. A grass fire is finished by nightfall, but the stumps, the fallen logs, and the dry dung keep smoldering, sometimes for the better part of a day, because a low, slow burn inside a rotten trunk has almost no air and no hurry. Break one open, push in dry grass, blow on it, and the fire comes back into your hands. The cost is walking toward a burn while every other large animal on the plain is walking away. There's a companion trick, and it's the one that turns a night into a chain of nights. Bank the coals. Rake the hot core into a tight pile, cover it with its own ash so almost no air gets through, and it will hold until morning. Sweep the ash off at dawn, add shavings, breathe on it, and yesterday's fire is today's. Done well, you never start over. Now you're feeding a mouth. A campfire kept going through a cold night, burned through something on the order of 10 to 20 kilograms of wood. More if the wood is green or wet, and every kilogram of it gets carried in by somebody before dark. Someone also stays half awake, pushing log ends into the middle. Miss a few hours, and you are back out on the savanna, waiting for lightning. Rain is the other enemy, and it explains part of why we find these fires where we find them. A rock overhang is shelter for people, but it is also a dry floor, a windbreak, and a place where a woodpile can sit for a week without soaking. Choosing where to sleep starts to include choosing where the fire can survive a storm, and that decision leaves an archaeological trace, because the same overhangs get used over and over across tens of thousands of years. That daily grind is exactly why the earliest evidence is so hard to read. Burned dirt on an open African site can mean a hearth, or it can mean a tree stump that caught in a bushfire and baked the clay under itself for 6 hours. At Kubifora in Kenya, there are patches of oxidized sediment about 1.5 million years old, roughly the size of small fires, sitting in one place. At Chesawanja, there are lumps of baked clay of similar age. Both have been argued over for 40 years without resolution. Caves preserve better, which is why Wonderwerk carries weight, and why a lakeshore in Israel carries more. Gesher Benot Yaakov is around 790,000 years old, and it was occupied again and again as the lake edge shifted. Among the flint waste, there are tiny burned fragments, and burned flint is easy to identify because it reddens and cracks in a distinctive way. Those fragments are not spread evenly through the sediment. They cluster in small patches, and the same kind of patch shows up in one layer after another through a sequence covering something like 100,000 years. 12 archaeological levels, no continuity of population, the same habit each time. By 300,000 years ago, the picture sharpens. Kesem Cave, also in Israel, has a central hearth of roughly 4 square meters built up from repeated use, with butchery waste and tool-making debris arranged around it rather than in it. Fire had an address. The work happened at a set distance from that address, and the arrangement held long enough for the sediment to record it. None of this is free, so something has to be paying for it. Cooking is the largest item. Heat gelatinizes starch and unwinds protein, so a gut extracts fuel that raw plant tissue and raw meat simply don't hand over easily. It also does the chewing in advance. Great apes spend somewhere between a third and a half of their waking hours working their jaws. For humans, the figure is under 5% of the day. Those hours come back to you every day for life, and they are paid for with wood and attention rather than anatomy. Richard Wrangham built an argument on that. Brains are metabolically expensive, guts are too, and cooked food lets you shrink one to afford the other. The weak point is timing. The anatomical changes he points to appear roughly 1.5 to 2 million years ago, and the hearths we can actually excavate show up later. Either the archaeology is missing early fires, which is plausible given that a small open fire leaves almost nothing after a rain, or cooking arrived later than the theory needs. The gap is real, and it hasn't closed. Fire does other things that nobody disputes. It holds a rough bubble of space that large predators prefer not to enter, which makes it possible to sleep on the ground rather than wedged in a tree, and ground sleep is deeper sleep. It dries wet hides. It keeps insects off. It's one of the conditions that let a tropical primate get through a European winter, alongside clothing, shelter, and hunting technique. Then it turns into equipment. The Schöningen spears in Germany, about 300,000 years old, are worked hardwood, and hardening a wooden point in embers is a cheap trick that costs only patience. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, people were heating silkrete, a stone that flakes badly when cold, to somewhere in the range of 300 degrees, buried in sand beneath a fire, held there for hours, then cooled slowly. Get it right, and the stone comes out glossy and predictable and splits where you want. Get it wrong, and it cracks apart, and you've lost the material and the day. The clearest evidence for it is around 72,000 years old, with contested hints reaching much further back. Neanderthals ran a chemical process too. Birch bark heated with limited oxygen gives off a tar that hardens into a glue strong enough to hold a stone point on a shaft, and lumps of that tar turn up at their sites going back a couple of 100,000 years. Recent experiments show it can be produced by fairly simple above-ground methods, which lowers the difficulty considerably and leaves the interesting part standing. Somebody worked out that a particular bark, heated a particular way, yields a substance that doesn't exist in nature. Somebody else had to be told. Polly Weisner recorded conversations among the Jew/Huansi in the Kalahari for years, then sorted them by time of day. Daytime talk is business. Who is going where, who owes what, complaints, criticism, negotiation. Roughly a third of it is people managing each other. After dark, at the fire, the proportions invert. About 80% of firelight conversation is stories. Named people, named places, journeys, what happened at a particular waterhole, what the old ones did, how the animals behave. Firelight is poor light for arguing and good light for describing. So the fire didn't only add 4 or 5 usable hours to the day, it created a slot whose main content is transmitted memory. Skills, roots, kin, animal behavior, and the group's shared history all have to pass from a mouth into an ear. And here is a nightly window where the food is done, nobody is going anywhere, and the children are still awake. Fire knowledge itself travels in that window, though mostly not as talk. It's the thing a child sees every evening for 15 years. Which wood spits and which holds heat. How to bank coals so they survive till dawn. How to split a coal without killing it. How far the wood has to be dragged in a wet season, and which branches are worth the walk. By the time you need it, you've watched it 10,000 times and never once been taught. If this is your kind of thing, the channel is full of it, and subscribing takes a second. The firewood side of the ledger sets a clock on how long people can stay in one place. Dry wood near a camp runs out before food does in a lot of environments, and hauling distance grows week by week until the return trip stops being worth it. When a group finally moves, the fire moves with it. The cheapest way needs no equipment. A slow-burning stick held at the right angle, smoldering at one end, will travel for hours if you feed it scraps of bark and keep it from flaring. In heavy rain, you put it against your body under a skin and keep walking. Fire spread across large distances at walking pace in one hand for a very long time before anyone built a container for it. Containers existed though, and we have one. The man who died in the Alps 5,300 years ago was carrying a cylinder of birch bark sewn with bast fiber, packed with fresh maple leaves, and inside the leaves was charcoal from several different tree species. Leaves for insulation, bark for a shell, coals for the next camp. He also had a lump of pyrite and a piece of tinder fungus in his kit, so he could produce fire from scratch. He carried the ember anyway, which tells you roughly how confident he was about doing it in wet weather with cold hands. In Tierra del Fuego, canoe people kept a fire burning inside the boat, on a bed of clay and sand, while paddling freezing channels in the rain. Magellan's crew saw those fires from the sea at night and named the place for them. So how hard was making it from nothing? 2 families of method exist, both older than we can date. Percussion is one. Strike iron pyrite with a flint edge and it throws sparks, but they are cooler and shorter lived than steel sparks, so the tinder has to be flawless. The standard answer is the inner layer of a birch bracket fungus, sliced thin and pounded until it's a soft mat that will catch a spark and hold it as a slow orange creep, sometimes treated in ash lye first. That coal then goes into a bundle of dry grass and gets swung through the air until the bundle flames. Friction is the other family. Spindle in a notch, wood dust ground hot until it forms a coal the size of a match head. It works. It also fails in humidity, needs a specific pairing of woods, and tears up hands that are out of practice.
Both methods have the same brutal property. They work beautifully when everything is dry and prepared, and they collapse when it isn't. A practiced person with seasoned wood and ready tinder can get a flame in a couple of minutes. The same person in damp air with wood that's been rained on can spend an afternoon producing smoke and nothing else. That variance is the whole reason a live coal is worth carrying. Neither leaves much behind, since wood rots and grass burns. The physical evidence is indirect. About 20 Middle Paleolithic hand axes from France carry microscopic wear and mineral traces along one edge consistent with repeated striking against pyrite, which would make them cutting tools and fire strikers at once, around 50,000 years ago. At another French site, there are ground pieces of manganese dioxide, a compound that lowers the temperature at which wood ignites. That's a reasonable combustion aid. It's also a black pigment, and the argument over which use came first is not finished. Then there's a pattern that doesn't fit the story we expect. Looking at Neanderthal sites in southwest France across long climate swings, one team found fire traces heavier in warm phases and thinner in cold ones. That's backwards for a technology you control. If you can make fire, you make more of it when you're freezing. If you depend on catching it from the landscape, you get less of it precisely when lightning and dry fuel are scarce, which is during a glacial. Other researchers read the same sites differently, and the question is open. It's still the strongest hint that even late, highly capable people may have been keepers first and makers second.
There were people keeping fire that way when Europeans arrived with notebooks. Observers in the Andaman Islands described communities whose fires burned continuously and who had no working method to start one from nothing. When a camp's fire died, someone walked to the neighbors and came back with a coal. That's less a technological failure than a social arrangement, and it runs in both directions. Neighboring groups had to stay on speaking terms permanently because sooner or later you need something from them that they can't refuse and you can't manufacture. A group that cannot restart alone keeps the path to the next camp open. In Tasmania, isolated for around 10,000 years, there's a long-standing claim that fire-making dropped out of the toolkit entirely, and fire was carried and shared instead. It's been challenged hard, and I'd leave it unresolved. What matters is that the claim is even arguable, because a skill can become optional when the workaround works, and this workaround worked for a very long time. When people stopped moving, the ember problem became an institution. Rome kept a fire in the Temple of Vesta that was not permitted to go out, tended in shifts by 6 women who served 30 years. If it died on your watch, you were held responsible and physically punished by the chief priest. The relighting is the detail that gives the game away. They didn't fetch a flame from the house next door, which would have taken 2 minutes. The fire had to be regenerated by rubbing wood from a fruit-bearing tree until it caught, or by focusing sunlight, using the oldest methods available inside a city full of furnaces and lamps. Greek colonies handled it as logistics. A group leaving to found a new city took fire from the mother city's public hearth and carried it to the site, and that carried flame is part of what made the new place a city rather than a camp. Zoroastrian temples still work on the same principle, with fires, their keepers say, have burned without a gap for well over 1,000 years, fed by hand, on a schedule, by people whose job is that and nothing else. All of it comes back to the person on the black savanna breaking open a smoldering stump and cupping a coal in dry grass. Feed it tonight. Hand it to someone who will be awake when you aren't. Firekeeping may be the longest continuous technical tradition our species has, and it survives only because the chain never broke. Every link was one household, one night, one person too tired to go get more wood who went anyway. Which leaves me stuck on a question I can't settle. If your group can catch fire from the landscape, carry it, bank it, and borrow it from the neighbors when it dies, how much pressure is there to invent the hard version at all? Tell me where you come down on that in the comments, because the specialists genuinely split on it. And if you want more of the ones where the unglamorous skill turns out to be holding everything up, there's plenty more coming.